Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. Chapter 9, Queen Alice. Well, this is grand, said Alice. I never expected I should be queen so soon. And I'll tell you what, your majesty, she said in a severe tone. She always was rather fond of scolding herself. It'll never do for you to be lolling around the grass like that. Queens have to be dignified, you know. So she got up and walked about, rather stiffly at first, as she was afraid that the crown might just fall off. But she comforted herself with the thought there was nobody to see her. And if I really am queen, she said, as she sat down again, I shall be able to manage it quite well in time. Everything was happening so oddly that she didn't feel a bit surprised at finding the Red Queen and the White Queen sitting close to her, one on each side. She would have liked very much to ask them how they came to be there, but she feared it might not be quite civil. However, there would be no harm, she thought, in asking if the game was over. Please, would you tell me, she began rather timidly to the Red Queen. Speak when you're spoken to, the Queen interrupted sharply. But if everybody obeyed that rule, said Alice, who was always ready for a little argument, if you only spoke when you were spoken to, and the other person always waited for you to begin, you see, nobody would ever say anything. Ridiculous, cried the Queen. Why don't you see, child? And here she broke off with a frown, and after thinking about it for a minute, suddenly changed the subject of the conversation. What do you mean by if you really are a queen? What right do you have to call yourself so? You can't be queen, you know, until you've passed the proper examination, and the sooner we begin it, the better. I only said if, poor Alice pleaded in a piteous tone. The two queens looked at each other, and the Red Queen remarked, with a little shudder, She says, she says she only if. And what does she know a great deal more than that? The White Queen moaned, wringing her hands. Oh, ever so much more than she did know than that. So you did know, the Red Queen said to Alice. Always speak the truth. Think before you speak, and write it down afterwards. I'm sure I didn't mean, Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen interrupted her impatiently. That's just what I complain of. You should have meant. What do you suppose is the use of a child without any meaning? Even a joke should have some meaning, and a child's more important than a joke, I hope. You couldn't deny that, even if you tried with both hands. I don't deny things with my hands, Alice objected. Nobody said you did, said the Red Queen. If I said you couldn't even if you tried. She's in that state of mind, said the White Queen, that she wants to deny something. Only she doesn't know what to deny. A nasty, vicious temper, the Red Queen remarked. And then the two were in uncomfortable silence for a minute or two. The Red Queen broke the silence by saying to the White Queen, I invite you to Alice's dinner party this afternoon. The White Queen smiled feebly and said, And I invite you. I didn't know I was to have a party at all, said Alice. But if there is to be one, I think I ought to be the one inviting the guests. We gave you the opportunity of doing it, remarked the Red Queen, but I dare say you've not had many lessons in manners yet. Manners are not taught in lessons, said Alice. Lessons teach you to do sums and things of that sort. Can you do addition? Said the White Queen asked. What's one and 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 one? I don't know. I lost count. She can't do addition, the Red Queen interrupted. Can you do subtraction? Take 9 from 8. 9 from 8? I can't, Alice very readily, but she can't do subtraction. And the White Queen said, Can you do division? Divide a loaf by a knife, and what's the answer to that? I suppose Alice was beginning, but the Red Queen answered for her, Bread and butter, of course. Try another subtraction sum. Take a bone from the dog. What remains? Alice considered. The bone wouldn't remain, of course, if I took it, and the dog wouldn't remain. It would come and bite me, and I'm sure I shouldn't remain. Then you think nothing would remain, said the Red Queen. Yes, I think that's the answer. Wrong as usual, said the Red Queen. The dog's temper would remain. But I don't see how. Why, look here, said the Red Queen. The dog would lose its temper, wouldn't it? Perhaps it would, Alice replied cautiously. Then if the dog went away and its temper would remain, the Queen exclaimed triumphantly. Alice said as gravely as she could, That might go different ways, but she couldn't help thinking to herself, what dreadful nonsense we are all talking. She can't do sums a bit, the Queen said together with great emphasis. Can you do sums? Said Alice, turning suddenly to the White Queen, for she didn't like being found so much at fault. The queen gasped and shut her eyes. I can do addition, she said, if you give me time, but I can't do subtraction under any circumstances. Of course, you know your ABC, said the Red Queen. To be sure I do. So do I, said the White Queen whispered. We'll often say it together, dear. And I'll tell you a secret. I can read words of one letter. Isn't that grand? However, don't be discouraged. You'll come to it with time. Here the Red Queen began again. Can you answer useful questions? She said. How is bread made? I know that, cried Aunt Alice eagerly. You take some flour. And where do you pick the flour? The White Queen asked. In the garden or in the hedge? Well, it isn't picked at all, Alice explained. It's ground. And how many acres of ground? Said the White Queen. You mustn't leave out such things. Fan your head, the Red Queen said anxiously. She'll be feverish after so much thinking. So they set about at work and fanned her with a bunch of leaves until she had to beg them to leave off, as it blew her hair about so. She's all right again now, and said the Red Queen, do you know languages? What's French for fiddle-dee-dee? Fiddle-dee-dee is not English, Alice replied gravely. Whoever said it was, said the Red Queen. Alice thought she saw a way out of this difficulty and said, if you'll tell me the language of fiddle-dee-dee, I will try to tell you the French for it, she exclaimed triumphantly. But the Red Queen drew herself up again and rather stiffly said, Queens never make bargains. I wish queens never ask questions, Alice thought to herself. Don't let us quarrel, said the White Queen in an anxious tone. What is the cause of the lightning? The cause of lightning, Alice said very decidedly, for she had felt quite certain about this, is the thunder. No, 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 she hastily corrected herself. I meant the other way around. It's too late to correct it, said the Red Queen. When you've got when you've once said a thing, that fixes it, and you must take the consequences. Which reminds me, said the White Queen, looking down nervously and clasping her and unclasping her hands. We had such a thunderstorm last Tuesday. I mean, the one at the last sets of Tuesdays, you know. Alice was puzzled. In our country, she remarked, there's only one day at a time. The Red Queen said, that's a poor, thin way of doing things. Now here we mostly have days or nights, 2 or 3 at a time, and sometimes in the winter we take as many as 5 nights together, for warmth, you know. Are 5 nights warmer than one night? Alice ventured to ask. 5 times as warm, of course, but they should be 5 times as cold by the same rule. Just so, cried the Red Queen. 5 times as warm and 5 times as cold, just as I'm 5 times as rich as you are and 5 times as clever. Alice sighed and gave up. It's exactly like a riddle with no answer, she thought. Humpty Dumpty saw it too, the White Queen went on in a low voice, more as if she were talking to herself. He came to the door with a corkscrew in his hand. What did he want? Asked the Red Queen. He said he would come in, the White Queen went on, because he was looking for a hippopotamus. Now, as it happened, there wasn't such a thing in the house that morning. Is there generally? Alice asked in a quite astonished tone. Well, only on Thursdays, said the Queen. I know what he came for, said Alice. He wanted to punish the fish, because here the White Queen began again. It was such a thunderstorm, you can't think. And she could never, you know, said the Red Queen. And as part of the roof came off, and ever so much thunder got in, and it went about, rolling and rocking around the room in great lumps, and knocking over tables and things, till I was so frightened I couldn't remember my own name. Alice thought to herself, I never should try to remember my name in the middle of an accident. Where would you be of use for it? But she did not say things quite aloud for fear of hurting the poor Queen's feelings. Your Majesty must excuse her, the Red Queen said to Alice, taking one of the White Queen's hands into her own and gently stroking it. She means well, but she can't help saying foolish things as a general rule. The White Queen looked timidly at Alice, who felt she ought to say something kind, but really couldn't think of anything at the moment. She was never really well brought up, the Red Queen went on, but it's amazing how good-tempered she is. Pat her on the head and see how pleased she'll be. But this was more than Alice had the courage to do. A little kindness and putting her hair in papers would do wonders for her. The White Queen gave a deep sigh and laid her head on Alice's shoulder. I am so sleepy, she moaned. She's tired, poor thing, said the Red Queen. Smooth her hair and lend her your nightcap and sing her a soothing lullaby. I haven't got a nightcap with me, Alice remarked as she tried to obey the first direction. And I don't have know any soothing lullabies. I must do it for myself then, said the Red Queen, and she began, Hush a by lady in Alice's lap, till the feast ready, we've time for a nap. When the feast's over, we'll go to the ball, Red Queen, White Queen, Alice and all. And now you know the words, she added, and she put her head down on Alice's other shoulder. Just sing it through to me. I'm getting sleepy too. And in another moment, both the queens were fast asleep and snoring loudly. What am I to do? Exclaimed Alice, looking about in great perplexity, as as first one round head and then the other rolled down from her shoulder and lay like a heavy lump in her lap. I don't think it ever happened before that any one of them had to take care of two queens asleep at once. No, not at all in the history of England. It couldn't, you know, because they never have more than one queen at a time. Do wake up, you heavy things, she went on in an impatient tone. But there was no answer, just gentle snoring. The snoring got more distinct every minute and sounded more and more like a tune, and at last she could even make out the words, and she listened so eagerly that when two great heads suddenly vanished from her lap, she hardly missed them. She was standing before an arched doorway in which were the words Queen Alice in large letters on each side of the arch, and there was a bell handle, one marked visitor's bell and the other servant's bell. I'll wait until the song is over, thought Alice, and then I'll ring the which bell must I ring? She went on, very puzzled by the names. I'm not a visitor, but I'm not a servant. There ought to be one marked Queen, you know. Just then the door opened a little way, and a creature with a long beak put its head out for a moment and said, No admittance till the week after next, and shut the door again with a bang. Alice knocked and rang in vain for a long time, but at last a very old frog who was sitting under the tree got up and hobbled slowly toward her. He was dressed in bright yellow and had enormous boots on. What is it now? Said the frog in a deep, hoarse whisper. Alice turned round, ready to find fault with anybody. Where's the servant whose business is to answer this door? She began angrily. Which door? Said the frog. Alice almost stamped with irritation at the slow drawl in which she spoke. This door, of course. The frog looked up at the door with large, dull eyes for a minute, and then went nearer and rubbed it with his thumb as if he were trying to see whether the paint would come off. Then he looked at Alice. To answer the door, he said, What's it been asking of? He was so hoarse that Alice could scarcely hear him. I don't know what you mean, she said. I speaks English, doesn't I? The frog went on. Or are you deaf? What what did it ask you? Nothing, Alice said impatiently. I've been knocking at it. Shouldn't you do that? Shouldn't you do that? The frog muttered. Wexes it, you know. And then he went up and gave the door a kick with one of his great feet. You let it alone, he panted out as he hobbled back to the tree. And it'll let you alone, you know. At the moment, the door flung open and a shrill voice could be heard singing. To the looking-glass world, it was Alice that said, I've a sceptre in my hand and a crown on my head. Let the looking-glass creatures, whatever they be, come dine with the Red Queen, the White Queen, and me. And hundreds of voices joined in the chorus. Then fill up the glasses as quick as you can, and sprinkle the table with buttons and bran. Put cats in the coffee and mice in the tea, and welcome Queen Alice with 30 times 3. And then followed a confused noise of cheering, and Alice thought to herself, 30 times 3 makes 90. I wonder if anyone's counting. And in a minute there was silence again, and the same shrill voice sang another verse. O looking glass creature, quoth Alice, draw near. 'Tis an honour to see me, and a favour to hear. This privilege is high, to have dinner and tea, along with the Red Queen, the White Queen, Alice, and me. And then came the chorus again. Then fill up the glasses with treacle and ink, and then anything else that's pleasant to drink. Mix with the cider and the wool with the wine, and welcome Queen Alice 90 times 9. 90 times 9, Alice repeated in despair. Oh, that'll never be done. Oh, I'd better go in at once. And in she went, and there was dead silence the moment she appeared. Alice glanced nervously along the table, and she walked up to the large hall and noticed that there were about 50 guests of all kinds. Some were animals, some were birds, and there were even a few flowers among them. I'm glad they've come without waiting to be asked, she thought. I should never have known who were the right people to invite. There were 3 chairs at the head of the table. The red queen and white queens were already taken 2 of them, and the middle one was empty. Alice sat down in it, rather uncomfortable at the silence, and longing for someone else to begin to speak. At last the Red Queen began, "You've missed the soup and the fish. Put on the joint." And the waiters came and set a leg of mutton before Alice, who looked at it quite anxiously, as she'd never had to carve a joint before. "You look a little shy. Let me introduce you to that leg of mutton," said the Red Queen. "Alice, mutton, mutton, Alice." The leg of mutton got up in the dish and made a little bow to Alice, and returned Alice returned the bow, not knowing whether to be frightened or amused. "May I give you a slice?" she said, and taking up her knife and fork, and looking from one queen to the other. "Certainly not," the Red Queen said, very decidedly. "It isn't quite etiquette to cut anyone until you've been introduced to it. Remove the joint." And the waiters carried it off and brought a large plum pudding in its place. "I won't be introduced to the pudding, please," Alice said rather hastily, "or we shall get no dinner at all. May I give you some?" But the Red Queen looked sulky and growled, "Pudding, Alice, Alice, pudding. Remove the pudding." And the waiters took it away so quickly that Alice couldn't return its bow. However, she didn't see why the Red Queen should be the only one to give the orders. So as an experiment, she called out, "Waiter, bring back that pudding." And there it was again in a moment, like a conjuring trick. It was so large that she couldn't help feeling a little shy with it, as she had been with the mutton. However, she conquered her shyness, and by a great effort she cut a slice and handed it to the Red Queen. "What impertinence!" said the pudding. "I wonder how you'd like it if I were to cut up a slice out of you, you creature." It spoke with a thick, suety sort of voice, and Alice hadn't a word to say in reply. She could only sit and look at it and gasp. "Make a remark," said the Red Queen. "It's ridiculous to leave us all in conversation with the pudding." "Do you know, I've had such a quantity of poetry repeated to me today," began Alice, a little frightened, finding that the moment she opened her lips there was dead silence, and all the eyes were fixed upon her. "And it's a very curious thing. I think every poem has had fishes in it in some way. Did you know they're so fond of fishes all about here?" She spoke to the Red Queen, whose answer was a little wide of the mark. "As to fishes," she said very slowly and solemnly, putting her mouth close to Alice's ears, "Her White Majesty knows a lovely riddle, all in poetry, all about fishes. Shall she repeat it?" "Her Red Majesty is so very kind to mention it," the White Queen murmured in Alice's other ear, in a voice of cooing like a pigeon. "It would be such a treat. May I?" "Please do," said Alice very politely. The White Queen laughed with delight and stroked Alice's cheek, and she began, "First the fish must be caught. That is easy. A baby, I think, could have caught it. Next the fish must be bought. That is easy. A penny, I think, would have bought it. Now cook me the fish. That is easy, and will not take more than a minute. Let it lie in the dish. That is easy, because it's already in it. Bring it here. Let me sup. It's easy to take such a dish on the table. Take the dish cover up, and it is so hard that I fear I'm unable. For it's to hold it like glue, hold the lid in the dish while it lies in the middle, which is the easiest to do. Undish cover the fish, and or dish cover the riddle. Take a moment to think about it, and then guess," said the Red Queen. "Meanwhile, we'll drink to your health." "Queen Alice's health!" she screamed at the top of her voice, and all the guests began drinking it directly, and very queerly they managed it. Some of them put their glasses upon their head like extinguishers, and all the drink trickled down their faces. Others upset the decanters and drank the wine as it ran off the edge of the table, and 3 of them, who looked to be kangaroos, scrambled into the dish of the roast mutton and began eagerly lapping up the gravy. "Just like pigs in a trough," thought Alice. "You ought to return thanks in a neat speech," said the Red Queen, frowning at Alice as she spoke. "We must support you, you know," the White Queen whispered, as Alice got up to do it very obediently, but a little frightened. "Thank you very much," she whispered in reply, "but I can do well without." "That wouldn't be at all the thing," tried the Red Queen, and said very decidedly, so Alice tried to submit to it with good grace. "And they did push so," she said afterwards, as she was telling her sister the history of the feast. "You would have thought they wanted to squeeze me flat." In fact, it was rather difficult for her to keep in her place while she made such a speech. The two queens pushed her so, one on each side, that they nearly lifted her up into the air. I rise to return thanks, Alice began, but she really did rise as she spoke, and several inches. But she got hold of the edge of the table and managed to pull herself down again. Take care of yourself, screamed the White Queen, seizing Alice's hair with both her hands. Something's going to happen. And then, as Alice described it afterwards, all sorts of things happened in the moment. The candles all grew up to the ceiling, towards something like a bed of rushers of fireworks at the top. As to the bottles, they each took a pair of plates, which they hastily fitted on as wings, and so forth, and the forks had legs, like fluttering about them in all directions. And very like birds they look, thought Alice to herself, as well as they could, and a dreadful confusion was at the beginning. At this moment she heard a hoarse laugh at her side, and she turned to see what was the matter with the White Queen. But instead of the Queen, there was a leg of mutton sitting in the chair. "Here I am!" cried a voice from the soup tureen, and Alice turned again, and just in time to see the Queen's broad, good-natured face grinning at her for a moment over the edge of the tureen before she disappeared into the soup. It was not a moment to be lost. Already several of the guests were lying down in the dishes, and the soup ladle was walking up the table toward Alice's chair and beckoning impatiently to get out of its way. "I can't stand it any longer," she cried as she jumped up and seized the tablecloth with both her hands. One good pull, and the plates and the dishes, the gas, the candles came crashing to the floor in a heap. "And as for you," she went on, turning fiercely to the Red Queen, whom she considered to be the cause of all this mischief. But the Queen was no longer at her side. She had suddenly dwindled down to the size of a little doll, and was now on the table merrily running round and round after her own shawl, which was trailing behind her. At any other time Alice would have felt surprised at this, but she was far too much excited to be surprised at anything now. "As for you," she repeated, catching hold of the creature in the very act of jumping over a bottle which had just lit upon the table, "I'll shake you into a kitten, that I will."